Watchmen is a really interesting property. I decided to watch the movie, but I wanted to see how it held up not only as a film, but as an adaptation, so I read the comic series right before watching the movie. Alan Moore, who was the creator of the comic, has come out and said that he hates adaptation, and given how many adaptations there are of his universe, I was a little cautious at first going into the movie, given how many plot threads there are in the comic, but seeing that the movie was almost 3.5 hours, I had a bit of optimism going in, thinking there might be a chance that we get to everything, or at least the most important things. I really enjoyed the comic and found it to be really thought-provoking. Watchmen essentially takes the premise of the Boys comic, that being what if superheroes aren't actually good people, and makes those same superheroes true characters. There's a lot of characters in the main cast, and they all get their time to shine and get fleshed out. The original comic was released in 12 issues over a year's time, and is considered to be one of, if not the most influential comic series of all time. So this film has big shoes to fill. Let's see if the film lives up. Things kick off in 1985 with the comedian sitting in his living room, when suddenly a masked man breaks in and attacks him. The thing that stood out to me the most at first is the fact that the comedian knows he's being attacked, yet instead of going for the gun immediately, he stands up for a second. He ends up going for the gun anyway, and I know they wanted to save Vight's bullet ability for the end, but they could have just not had the gun in the room. I do like the smile design on the gun though, and the fight outside of this is pretty well choreographed. In the comic, we don't really get to see the fight, and things are pretty much left to our own imagination. The fight plays out close to the way I imagined it, so I like the addition. This is one of the rare times where the adaptation adding something makes it better. We see that the comedian is skilled, but he just doesn't have enough in the tank. Right before the fight ends, he says it's all a joke. When I started Watchmen, I had no clue that he would be so important. I thought his death would be the first in a string of crimes that would lead to the mastermind, but I really like how the most important things about him are revealed only after he's dead. It's a great parallel for the real world, an example of not knowing what you have until it's gone. We then cut to a montage showing heroes throughout the last 40 to 50 years working together. We see Silk Spectre seen as more of a sex symbol than a hero, as the police chief looks down her shirt. We see the silhouette kiss her girlfriend on VJ Day, and since that was a much different time, we see the smiles of the people behind her fade. But then when we see her later on, she's been killed for the same thing she was happily doing out on the street. Bob Dylan's The Times They Are A-Changin' plays as the montage goes from golden age happiness to something closer to the edginess of a comic from the 90s. The message is clear, the good old days are far behind these characters. Also, in the comic, Dr. Manhattan says that there were 2 shots that went off when JFK was assassinated, and I like how they show that the comedian is the second shooter. That's the exact type of mission you would expect a morally gray character like him to take on. Rorschach shows up to the crime scene and gives his iconic rant. Rorschach is a pretty polarizing person, and Alan Moore himself intended Rorschach to be satirical and was surprised when he found out so many people enjoy him, which I found odd. Rorschach might stink and he might not talk super eloquently, and even though I disagree with him on certain things, he has his values and he sticks to them. He's the only one of the Watchmen who decides that killing millions isn't okay, and that Veidt deserves to answer for his crimes. His views might be too black and white, but at least he's trying to right the world. Hollis Mason and Dan Dryberg, the men who used to operate as Night Owl, sit in an office and reminisce. Dan, despite being a Batman analogy, looks and acts just like Christopher Reeves as Clark Kent, which was probably done at the time to make sure that there wouldn't be any copyright infringement issues. When Dan gets home, he finds his door open and his lock broken. It turns out Rorschach is the one who broke in, and it's good that he was, because if it was someone intending to attack him, he would have walked right into it. Rorschach has come to warn him that the comedian is dead and that people are coming after the Watchmen. This brings up a problem that I have with the movie and the comic. One murder isn't an indication of a trend. Until Veidt gets attacked, there is no indication that this will continue. Part of me think that Rorschach knew that and was missing the kinship he had before the Keene Act, so he went to Dan to get that back. Either way, the two go down into Dan's hideout and talk about the old days. Rorschach says Dan quit, and that's an interesting way of looking at things given how they were outlawed. If Dan had kept going, there would be more attention on the two, which would increase their chances of being caught. Rorschach working as an individual was enough to be put on the FBI's most wanted list, and a superhero duo running around beating up criminals would make the two jump to the top of that list. I think this is also Rorschach letting his nostalgia cloud his judgment, because you would think he would realize that, but it's still odd. Rorschach swings by Dr. Manhattan's house after leaving Dan, and this scene could have been a lot better. In the comic, Rorschach tries to warn Manhattan, only to get teleported out because Laurie gets mad at him for the way he views the situation between her mother and the comedian, while in the movie, Laurie seems to just have a general disdain for Rorschach, and that feeling goes on throughout the movie with no explanation. Dr. Manhattan just kicks Rorschach out so he can get back to his research, like a kid kicking his little brother out of his room so he can play Xbox. It seems like a small thing, but leaving something like that out robs the first impression of these two characters. The comic shows us that Dr. Manhattan is really protective of Laurie, and we learn that Laurie has a valid reason to be a little mad at Rorschach, while in the movie Dr. Manhattan is an iPad kid wanting to get back to his toys, and Laurie is just mad for no reason. These two get their moment to shine later on, but this intro didn't give me too much hope. Dan and Laurie go out to dinner to start up their romance arc, proving that if your girlfriend is super excited to go to a nice restaurant with another man, it might be time to break up. I love the way that Dan drops the bomb of the comedian being dead so abruptly, because it not only matches up with the way I imagine it while reading, the line delivery in and of itself fits the awkwardness of Dan's character so well. We cut to the comedian's funeral, which then leads to a flashback. The comedian tries to assault Laurie's mother, only to be stopped by Hooded Justice. After that, the comedian and Dr. Manhattan work together to win the Vietnam War. The two celebrate in a bar, only for a woman to show up and tell the comedian she is pregnant with his kid, which barely phases him, causing the woman to attack him. The attack makes the comedian mad enough that he kills the woman, and when Dr. Manhattan tries to call him out on this, the comedian points out that Dr. Manhattan could have stopped him, but he didn't. These two scenes do a great job of establishing just how screwed up in the head these superheroes are, which is an issue that becomes more and more apparent as the story goes on. You really get a sense for how deeply depraved the comedian is, and how quickly he will fly off the handle. There was a line from the comedian that was a bit on the nose for me, that being, "If we had lost Vietnam, we as a country would have gone crazy," but it's not bad enough that it took me out of the scene, just something that stood out. Dr. Manhattan not intervening and getting called out for losing his touch with humanity is a really good choice. The surprise of the situation going sideways so fast seems like it really shook him deeply enough that his detachment from humanity got even worse, leading him to the point where we see him nonchalantly say that nuclear holocaust is super likely. I like the fact that with Dr. Manhattan, even though he exists outside of time, the things he experienced still shape him in a big way. They do a good job of balancing his near omnipotence with the little vulnerability he does have. After Moloch, who was the comedian's worst enemy, shows up at his funeral, Rorschach breaks into his house to interrogate him. Moloch reveals that the comedian came up to him a few weeks before he died, crying and seemingly unable to say a coherent sentence. Up until this point, we've seen the comedian be completely horrible, and while he won't get fully redeemed by the end of the story, we get to see a deeper and more personal side of Eddie Blake as the movie goes on. Alan Moore made sure that all of his characters were multifaceted, and Zack Snyder translated that on screen very well. Dealing with the stress of Laurie leaving and reporters accusing him of giving the people around him cancer, Dr. Manhattan decides that he's had enough of humanity and he leaves Earth. I like how Manhattan is this seemingly detached person, and even though we get a great montage showing how he loses himself over the years, the person he was can still be reached in a way. He cared about his ex-girlfriend and his best friend, and the implication that he might have been the one who killed them hurts him deeply. Veidt gets attacked at his office, finally proving Rorschach's theory about people coming after the Watchmen. Obviously, I spoiled the fact that Veidt is the one in control here earlier, so viewing this whole scene from that perspective is really interesting. If you know the twist, it seems pretty clear that Veidt knew he was never in danger, and he was the one who gave the hitman cyanide. But if you don't know the twist, it does look a little weird that Veidt is screaming for a name while covering the guy's mouth. Rorschach gets a message from Moloch, who wants to meet up, but when he gets there, he finds that Moloch is dead and the police have set a trap for him. I feel like killing Moloch was a bit overkill, considering Rorschach has done enough that the police surely have enough evidence to put him away for a long time. There was no need to frame him for murder as an extra charge. Rorschach gets put in jail, being forced into therapy sessions that are a great and natural way to give some backstory on such a mysterious character. These sessions led us into the mind of Rorschach, and even though we don't get to see how this affects the therapist nearly as much, these scenes are still amazing. This world is sick and twisted, and you can see the steps that led Rorschach down this path. The true horror of the stories Rorschach is telling sneaks up on you, and flips a run-of-the-mill crime story or sad background into something that makes you want to wash your eyes out once it's over. In the comic, these stories change the therapist drastically, making him talk and emote like Rorschach, slowly losing himself. The fact that Alan Moore wrote a character who relates to Rorschach after a few conversations but was surprised people liked Rorschach is crazy to me. Maybe he thought that because the therapist slowly became more and more estranged with his wife, people would think that Rorschach's line of thinking would lead to nothing but loneliness. Dan and Laurie work together to save a group of people from a burning building, and afterwards they celebrate together in the infamous Hallelujah scene. I can't show it obviously, and it's not a huge thing, but why did they go with this song? I kind of found it funny, but I don't think that was the intended effect. It is a good song though, I'll give it that. After the two are done, they decide to go save Rorschach, who has been spending his time outside of therapy attacking the other inmates. They get him out without too much trouble, but once they get back to Dan's house, Dr. Manhattan is waiting, and he takes Laurie to Jupiter. We'll come back to them later, but for now let's talk about Hollis Mason. A gang breaks into his house and Hollis fights off his attackers, flashing back to his old days as Night Owl. I like the theory that this is his PTSD kicking in, which makes sense given how his brain seems to think that he's back in the 50s. Hollis does his best, but ultimately he's just too old to fight off these thugs. It's like watching Muhammad Ali fight Larry Holmes. In both cases, their brains know what to do, but their bodies can't keep up anymore. I like the editing in this scene a lot. Going from the music and the pretty images of the villains of the past to the sounds of Hollis getting hit by his own trophy is perfectly jarring. Dr. Manhattan leaving changes the geopolitical landscape drastically, and the US is on the verge of nuclear war as Laurie and Dr. Manhattan argue over whether or not saving humanity is worth it, leading to Laurie learning that her father is the comedian, which was a crazy twist. This reveal shows Dr. Manhattan the miracle of human existence, being completely captivated by the fact that Laurie's mother could love the comedian after all he did, which makes him come back to Earth. I love the way humanity's existence is presented here. It's something we always take for granted, but thinking about the fact that if one little thing in the past changed, you might not exist is a cool concept. Dan and Rorschach break into Veight's office, and they eventually discover that Veidt is behind all the attacks, so the two go to confront him. The two arrive in his lair and try to take him out, only to be easily beaten and informed that Veight's plan was set into motion 30 minutes before they arrived. Veight's level of preparedness sells this so well. He stayed sharp throughout the time the Watchmen were apart, and he knew the weaknesses of all his teammates, so of course he had a plan for them, and of course he made sure there was no way he could be stopped. The decision to start the plan 30 minutes ahead of time elevates Veight's monologuing from an average villain speech to the words of a horrific mastermind. When the plan succeeds, the Watchmen see the benefit in Veidt giving a threat for the people to unite against, so they decide to stay silent, and Rorschach of course refuses, leading Dr. Manhattan to blow him up. This is the saddest scene in the movie by far. Rorschach has committed everything up to this point trying to keep as many of the Watchmen alive as possible, just for them to justify genocide because it's easier than telling the people the truth. Dan is also seeing Rorschach without his mask for the first time, finally being able to put a face to one of his best friends, and that friend dies less than 10 seconds later. Personally, I think Rorschach knew that he wouldn't be allowed to live, but he had already sent his journal away, and I wouldn't be surprised if he felt betrayed by his friends who were bending and breaking under Veight's pressure. Rorschach had nothing left to live for, and he had done all he could. This is one of the most mixed reception movies I have ever seen. Some view the movie as the second coming, while others say that it's the worst superhero adaptation ever made. The scenes flow together pretty nicely, but if you're looking for a fast-paced superhero movie like the ones that are more popular today, the pace of this one might drag a bit for you. Watchmen is a big story with a lot of complex characters, so the slower pace fits the narrative perfectly. Alan Moore might hate adaptation, but this movie is one of the best out there.